Thank you for being here in person. We're delighted to have you here, and I am especially delighted to be here with my old friend Gish Jen, who I've known for a couple of decades, and we've had shared adventures in several parts of China over the course of that time when I was living there as a correspondent. I'm Mary Kay Magistad. I'm the Associate Director of the Center on U.S. China Relations here at Asia Society. And we will be talking about Gish's latest book, which is now, just as of yesterday, out in paperback, Thank You, Mr. Nixon, Stories. It's a collection of 11 short stories that basically span the 50 years of U.S. China relations since President Nixon went to China in 1972. And just as one of the many accolades this book has received, on the cover it says from NPR, brilliant and exceptional collection written with intelligence, wit, and grace. It's one of the best books of Jen's remarkable career. This is your 9th book.
Yes, amazingly.
Before we launch into conversation, I also just wanted to let you know about some of the things coming up at Asia Society and also what is in the museum now. Since you're in the building, it's a few floors down. There is a mirror image, a transformation of Chinese identity, which features artworks by 7 artists who were born in mainland China in the 1980s, and it reflects the dramatic economic, political, and cultural shifts they have experienced in their lifetimes. There's also an exhibition called Visionary Legacies, a tribute to Harold J. Newman, in memory of our longtime supporter and trustee and his passion for contemporary art. The show features some of his favorite iconic works from our contemporary art collection, including seminal videos by Cao Fei and Yang Fudong. Upcoming events on next Monday, November 7th at 3:30, so it's an afternoon event, not an evening event. Asia Society's president and CEO, Kevin Rudd, will be in conversation with the Eurasia Group's Ian Bremmer about geopolitical risks, including Russia's next step in the war with Ukraine, U.S. China relations, and what to expect from the U.S. midterm elections, which of course will be the following day. And then on Monday, November 21st at 6 p.m., as part of our new China-wise book series, which we at the Center on U.S. China Relations are doing with the new Center on China Analysis, which is also under it is under the Asia Society Policy Institute. We have an event with the China File editor from our center, Susie Jakes, in conversation with the German Marshall Fund's Andrew Small to launch his new book, which is called No Limits, The Inside Story of China's War with the West. And finally, there's another China-wise book event on December 1st at 6:30 with the Wall Street Journal's Eric Schwartzel and academic Ying Zhu discussing their recent books on China's relationship with Hollywood and the U.S. movie industry. And they will be in conversation with the Center on U.S. China Relations Director, Orville Schell. So, on to our conversation. And I think a great way to start is with you reading a little from the first story in the book, Thank You, Mr. Nixon story, which I've got to say, in my personal opinion, has one of the better first lines of a short story.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm not to boast, but so I am Gish Jen. I don't want to boast, but it is true that the very, very first event I did for this book was a Zoom, still COVID. And one of the people on the Zoom was the chairman of the Comp Lit department at Harvard. And to my, I mean, I should have taped it. And he said, this is one of the best opening lines in American literature since Call Me Ishmael. I was just like, is somebody taping? Is somebody taping? Anyway, so this book, it begins with Richard Nixon's visit to China, and I think that, of course, especially right now, China's a very serious topic, but and don't get me wrong, I mean, I get how serious it is, but it is also great fodder, it turns out, for fiction writers. And so serious and pessimistic as many people have been, as you will hear, I've been having a great time with it. So this is the title story, Thank You, Mr. Nixon. I'm just going to read a little bit. It is a letter written by a young girl who is in heaven posthumously, obviously, and she is writing to poor Richard Nixon, who is in hell. So it's addressed, Mr. Richard Nixon, 9th Ring Road, Pit 1A. Dear Mr. Nixon, I don't know if you will remember me, especially now that I am in heaven and you are in hell. I was one of the little girls you talked to when you came in 1972. Do you remember? Not the one in the famous picture. I was the other one. We were in a park in Hangzhou. That was your other stop besides Beijing and Shanghai. A famous place with a beautiful lake called West Lake. It was February, and you mostly had your hands in your pockets. Maybe your fingers were cold. First, you talked to the girl whose mother was right behind her. Of course, she smiled just the way she was supposed to, and someone took that picture. Then you talked to a little boy who was dressed in a new coat, but who was actually supposed to be in the background. That's why he didn't know which hand to reach out when you wanted to shake hands. Everyone laughed. But some people worried because they did not think you would talk to the boy. That was not the plan. And I was very embarrassed, but you did not seem to notice. Just as you did not seem surprised that it just so happened that the two girls you happened to run into in the park were wearing such beautiful coats, so new and perfect, kind of an orange-pink color. Nor were you surprised that when you asked where my mother was, I said in the city. Shouldn't you have wondered what I could mean since we were in Hangzhou, and Hangzhou was a city? In fact, my mother was living in Shanghai then because she had been assigned to a unit there, but probably you had no idea people were assigned anywhere. Anyway, my red scarf was a real red scarf. That really was what we wore if we were little red guards, and I really was a little red guard. But actually, that was not my real coat. Actually, my mother had to piece it together out of 2 other coats. Because she sewed in a factory, though, it came out just as if it were made in a factory. Really, the whole China you saw was a tailor-made China, a Potemkin China, you might say. Not that anyone would have said that then. That's only how we talk in heaven, where we know all kinds of things. For example, we know that today there are a lot of things you cannot say in China, but back then there were even more. And while today you have to guess what you can't say, back then they would just tell you. No one was allowed to shout, "Down with the American imperialists," to your face. On the radio, the phrase American imperialists has suddenly disappeared, as if everyone forgot it all at once, which no one thought was particularly strange. We all knew how to forget, after all. We were good at it. And if there was a face we had mastered, it was a stone face, for things changed all the time. One day, Comrade Lin Biao was a hero, for example. The next day, we forgot he was ever there. The streets were cleaned up before you came, with certain slogans removed and new ones put up. The shelves of the stores were filled, and people were made to stay at work and work late. They were made to stay at school and work late so the streets would not be so crowded. Those of us students who were supposed to be background students in the park were told what to understand. What did the American journalists ask things like, "Do you have enough to eat and drink?" Or, "Do you like America?" Our teacher asked us. "Do you understand them?" Of course, that was a stupid question because anyone who answered yes would not have been picked to be a background student to begin with. But no one said it was stupid. Instead, we promised that even if the translator spoke perfect Mandarin, we would not understand him. We were not supposed to understand anything about a man going to the moon either, which was easy since most of us did not actually know the American imperialists had put a man on the moon until we were told that we didn't know anything about it. As for whether we were supposed to volunteer, we had gangs of Red Guards breaking into our homes and destroying everything, much less they put people out into the yard and beat them to death. You may guess whether we were supposed to say these things or not. No, we were smart. And having been told to be neither humble nor arrogant, neither cold nor hot, we were exactly that. Although I was so happy in my new coat, it was hard not to be warm with happiness. Indeed, I thought it was the most beautiful coat in the world until I saw your wife's coat. Can I call her Pat, now that we're all dead? She did not wear her red coat to the park. That was a disappointment. At the park, she wore a fur coat, maybe because it was so cold. But I saw the red coat later. And anyway, we students all knew about the red coat. We had heard about the red coat. It was already a famous coat. Of course, we understood, too, very well that we did not love it. Though China had become a sea of dark blue and gray and black, with just a little color allowed for us children, for everyone else, a red coat was bourgeois, after all. It was anti-revolutionary. It was corrupt and corrupting. Couldn't we feel its pull? That was because it was venal, imperialist, American, beautiful. No, we did not love it. We did not think how suitable it was that a beautiful coat came from a country whose name in Chinese literally meant beautiful. China might be 中国, the middle country, but America was 美国, the beautiful country. A beautiful country full of beautiful coats. What could that be but evil? The history books say that China opened when you shook hands with Chairman Mao, but I think it began with that coat. Because if on the outside we were neither humble nor arrogant, neither cold nor hot, on the inside we were torn. We loved our country, but it was not red flags we wanted. It was red coats. Thank you, Mr. Nixon, for bringing that coat. I think I'll stop there.
So the way the book is constructed, and also I think arguably the way it actually happened, that was kind of the big bang moment.
Yes.
U.S. China relations.
Yes. I mean, everybody thinks it was Chairman Mao, but no. But the Chinese people, they saw that coat and they were in love, right? Yeah, they were in love.
And for you, so I'm going to weave back and forth between your writing and your actual experience.
Yeah, okay.
So that was from your writing. At the time, you were a teenager,
right,
the daughter of Chinese immigrants. You had an idea of China in your own head at that point. You hadn't been there yet. What was it?
Well, of course, the China that I knew from my parents, they didn't talk about it that much, but, it was like a heavenly place. Because especially my father had grown up on the shores of Lake Tai. I don't know how many of you are familiar with China, but right west of Shanghai, there's a big lake called Lake Tai. And of course, it is the best located lake in China, because it's right next to Shanghai. Shanghai is this big port. It is in the kind of the breadbasket, the very, very, very most fertile part of China. It's the land of fish and rice. There's lots of food. And here is this one lake. And Shanghai is here, and Yixing, my father's hometown, is here. So he is living in the best possible place you could live in China, really. It's just, and his family kind of dominated that town. So he grew up in this unbelievably kind of idyllic way. And everything about it, in his view, was just perfect. So they had this very large house. In fact, they made a tape of it when it was torn down as a lesson to other people. It had my father's advisor. He got his PhD here in America, but his advisor once asked him, "Well, like, how big was your house?" And my father said, "Oh, 200-300 rooms." The advisor said, 200 or 300 rooms, but it really was 2 or 3. I mean, it was one of these huge family compounds. And my father was growing up. They had a cow in the garden. He would go outside and feed the horse down the street. There was a coffin maker next door. They would go, and I think this says a lot about kind of the comfort with death or whatever. They literally would go play in the coffin makers. They would kind of hide under the coffins, the shade there, and kind of hang out. Anyway, and they had a glass-bottom boat. You could kind of like look through the glass at the bottom of this thing and look at the fish in the water. He just loved it. He just loved it. So all of our ideas about China were that it was this heaven. It was just wonderful. That's not the China that I discovered when I went in 1981.
Yeah, which we'll get to in a minute.
Or 1979.
79, yeah. But that moment when Nixon visited China, do you remember how that played for your parents?
They knew, of course, and it was a very big deal, but they didn't really talk about it very much. So, that I know really from the history books. I don't know it firsthand. The first experience of China I had was in so after Nixon goes, then all the diaspora families can now go back to China. So, my parents had not been back for 35, 40 years, and it was very typical that, of these families, many of us went back to go see our families, right? So I was on one of these overseas Chinese tours, and my brother will remember this. Did you go on my brother's here, did you go on the very first trip? I can't remember. Did you go on the very first trip? No, you went on the second trip when I was teaching in Shandong. Anyway, we went back, and But we were on this overseas Chinese tour, and it was very, very, very different than we were expecting, of course. Starting with, it starts when you land, and they don't have like a real airstrip. The airstrip has been poured in sections, like a sidewalk. So you land, and it goes boom, 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 boom. That's only the beginning of it, And then you get to the hotel, and of course, the lights, because they don't have a lot of electricity, it's very, very dimly lit. There is no privacy. There are no locks on any of the doors. And not only are there no locks on any of the doors, and there's a hall monitor at the end, so the surveillance has already started. They're watching you. They would come into your room. They would rifle through you're standing right there. They would just walk in and look through your suitcase, and then walk out. They would pick something up, say, "What's this?" Say, "Oh, that's a Tampax." They would walk out. I mean, it was just like there was no privacy. And of course, it was very poor. I think one of the details is that the pats of butter that that were set up. The pats of butter were like gold. Some of you are nodding. You remember these early days, and there was very little butter, and so you would be presented this platter of butter. We're like, well, but I mean, truly, this is like, it would be like being given a platter of truffles. There are the little pats of butter. And I think, very shockingly for us, the Chinese food was terrible. We just thought, oh, we're going to China, you know what I mean? And actually, the cuisine standards had dropped very dramatically, and so the food was awful, lots and lots and lots of grease, and even my father was just like, don't eat it; it will make you sick. So it was quite a shock.
How much were you able to interact with people, just ordinary people?
Well, of course, they were very, in those early trips, they did not want you to talk to anybody. But of course, we were there to see our family, so we did talk to them. The people were very, 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 very interested in foreigners. I mean, just as in my book. I mean, so mobs of people would arrive everywhere you went, and that's before we even. On my second trip, my now husband came, and he's Caucasian. And I mean, he has blue eyes. I mean, I can't even tell you. He would leave the hotel, and 150 people would arrive just to stare at him, and to touch his beard, and to, But even in that first trip, even though we kind of looked sort of like them, but our clothes, the way we walk, everything was, because that remained a feature for some time. I think many, many years later, even when I was teaching in Beijing. So what was that, 2003, I think.
Yeah.
2003, my students would say, "Oh, we know you. We could tell, it's you. I'm just like them. We can tell it's you, and we know you're American by the way you walk. We walk in that very kind of free way, and they don't walk like that."
So what did your parents think of the China they found in 1979?
Well, of course, they were very happy to see their family.
Yeah. But
the China was not the China that they left. I mean, obviously, my family does. Both sides of my family came from very wealthy backgrounds, and what's that? Louder. Oh, louder. Okay. Oh, am I not talking to the? Can you hear me now? Oh, okay. Please, thank you. So they came from very wealthy backgrounds, and so it was I mean, the wealth that they had come from is a little staggering to us today. But to give you an idea, several of my cousins have sort of bowed legs, and that is because as children they were carried everywhere by the servants, and they didn't walk, and their legs were misshapen from being held on a servant's back. So it gives you an idea of just how wealthy they were. Mm. And of course, all that was gone. I mean, there's still vestiges of it. You get to it. One of my cousins went back, and and from out of nowhere, comes one of the servants, and he comes running up. He says, little master, you've come back." But mostly, the family compound is gone. My mother's family. Everything is gone. I mean, the whole world they knew was gone. So, of course, it's very traumatic in that way. And then the stories, of course, the relatives are telling story after story after story about the Cultural Revolution. It's terrible. I mean, one horrific story after the next. I think my parents are just sort of in shock, you know.
So that was the beginning of your experience in China.
Yes.
How would you say that changed you and your perception of what it meant to be from there? What it meant to be that a part of you was connected with this place?
Well, you know, I think that in the beginning, well, first I was just, you know, I was fascinated to see, because we grew up without any relatives, so this whole idea that actually that we were not just this little band of people, but actually not only had relatives, we had hundreds of relatives, you know. I mean, it was just a very different idea about our family. I mean, I just had no idea. And then, you know, I went back to teach in 1981, and it was so interesting to me because I could hear all these things that my parents would say, kind of, but they would say in English, but the whole way that they thought, I would actually hear coming out of the mouths of other people. And that's when I began to think, oh, there's this thing that's actually, it's not just our family, it's this thing that's being Chinese, right? You know, and like this fixation on whether places were clean, whether you like salty food or sweet food, what was your favorite food? You know, there's just like, and very importantly, this idea of 想办法, find a way. My father would say that all the time, find a way. You know, so the idea that here in America, if there is an obstacle, you move it. In China, the idea was you find a way around it. And you know, and everywhere I went, people were talking about finding a way around, looking for the back door. You know, and I was just like, oh my God, it's not just my parents. It's like actually over 1 billion people. and so, you know, so very drastically, you know, I think that's at that point I think, oh, there's this thing called culture. And actually, and you can see it in everything, in the way that they talk, how close they sit next to you. You know the way that people move, their ideas of personal space. You know, I mean, I know my aunties, they're just like, and I remember just thinking like, oh, actually, we actually grew up with that because I still remember one of my fondest memories as a child. Is our whole family, we had 5 kids in our family, we all pile into one little Volkswagen Bug, and so the 2 parents in the front, then the 3 bigger kids in the middle seat, and my 2 littlest brothers, are just babies, in what we called the box. So it's really the luggage compartment, behind the back seat. And there's a way in which today, if you asked my kids to do that, they would feel like, this car is just too small, But we loved it. We thought it was great, And when I was in China, I realized like, oh, actually, they have that same idea that to be all squished together is good, So everyone's not looking to find their spot. They like being squished together, and there are a lot of things like this. So I could go on and on and on, but I began. I guess to say that I began to this I think was the origins of my fascination with culture. And this feeling that, oh, if I go to China, I will understand this whole huge thing that I have grown up with and that is in me, but I don't understand its contours myself very well.
So you went back a couple of years later, in 1981, to teach English to coal mining engineers in Shandong province.
Yes.
What more did you understand from that experience?
Oh, well, I did, all these things, the Shangbanfa thing. And, it's funny, but there were even things like I myself, especially if I have like a carb-heavy meal, I am like comatose, so I definitely have the carb coma. I would never have thought that there was like a whole people who were just like that, but actually there were, and sure enough, they had a siesta built into the middle of their day, and I was just amazed at how well that suited me, So I would have this nice big Chinese lunch, and I'd take a nice nap, and then I'm kind of good to go. It was almost a little weird. I mean, a little of that feeling. It started the first time I got to Hawaii. And I reached up, I was in a bus, and I reached like I could reach the straps, like all the straps are like my height. And then you go to China, and all the clothes all fits you. And and the day, this kind of the rhythm of the day also fits you. And, you know, and then you're beginning to think like, whoa, I mean, there's something about me which is Chinese, you know? I mean, obviously I grew up in the United States and I'm, you know, I mean, obviously I'm also American, but there's a whole part of me that has come over via my parents, and it's now part of me.
You were teaching people who, at that point, would have lived through the Cultural Revolution, yes. Maybe were teenagers or yes. young adults. They were just moving into the 80s, which was this really interesting period in China where there was a great sense of possibility. Like a lot of different things yes. seemed like they were worth exploring and might be possible. I'm just wondering how that manifested itself in the classroom or in your conversations with your students.
Well, first of all, you know, because I did interview them all really as part of helping them practice their English. We had one-on-one. So I did hear all the stories, you know what I mean? I mean, it was just like every single day. I kind of braced myself because here comes another student with, you know, more terrible, terrible stories. But you could also see that things were, and I will say that, you know, there were many things in the classroom that were amazing to me. But one of the many amazing things were to see, you know, former Red Guards sitting right next to people who've been persecuted, and like, you know, that's in Duncan in China. I really couldn't believe that these people
Duncan
could actually.
in China is one of the stories in
yeah,
Thank You, Mr. Nixon.
Yeah, one of the stories in Thank You, Mr. Nixon, and I couldn't believe that they could sit next to each other after what had happened. I mean, I could not believe they could all just sit there learning English. You know.
Did they have a choice?
No. You know. I also remember the possibility. This is related to the red coat. One of my students, one of the younger female students, had a pair of pink plastic sandals, you know, and she really wasn't supposed to be wearing those sandals, right? But she wore them anyway, and I could just tell they were her favorite thing, you know, and I could tell that all the other girls were deeply envious of these pink plastic sandals. So you could kind of see that, you know, all that consumer desire that, you know, eventually kind of exploded in China, but you could see it. You could see it coming. You could also see the, you know, the drive. You know, all the drive. You know, look, the Chinese. You know, I mean, I think that I'm sure they were working very hard all through the 50s and 60s. But the ferocity with which my students studied was just incredible. So they taped everything, and then they would go. They didn't have any place. There was no library or anything like that. They would all take these stools. They would go out to the basketball court. They would all kind of sit there with their stools arranged so that they weren't facing each other. So everyone is, but they're all on this basketball court with their books, and they would sit there on those stools and study 4 hours straight without moving. I mean, it was incredible. And you could just sort of see, like, they had this, it was, for them, a lot of them had come a very long distance to come study with me, even though I was really, what did I know about teaching English? But I was a native speaker. And, you know, you could just sort of see that for them, this was this huge opportunity, and they were, you know, they were really down for it. And it was very touching. I mean, I still feel it was one of the best teaching experiences I ever had, because, you know, obviously, you know, the hunger to learn, I mean, it was almost overwhelming.
So I was first in China later in that decade, and then started living there in the mid-90s. And I remember at the time that there was just a real intense interest in just learning about people.
Yeah.
You know, you got into a taxi and sat in the front seat, and off, as long as you could speak some Chinese, like off you went. Like there was a long conversation, lots of questions, right? The questions changed over time, but I'm just kind of wondering, in the early 80s, what did people want to know about the United States, about America, about you?
Well, of course, in the beginning, they were, well, first of all, the question I got more than anything else in the beginning is, are you Japanese? You know, because I don't really look like, you know, classically Han Chinese. And they were fast, and they're very interested, you know what I mean? Are you Chinese? Are you Japanese? You know, and then they want to know where your parents from. You know what I mean? So it's this whole business of where your parents from is like very, very, very important. And then very slowly, they would get you kind of, are you really American? And they really, it's very, even in this century, if I once went to go visit a migrant workers school, and frankly, they all refused to believe that I was American. I mean, they categorically just they you can't be American. You're Chinese. I'm like, well, no, actually, it's not a racial category. I'm actually, my parents are Chinese. I came from, but they really could not accept that idea. So you can only imagine in the 1980s and 90s. I mean, it's just like it's a total, So there are a lot of like kind of, so what are you, and then followed by, when they hear that you're married to a white person, they're fascinated. They're just fascinated. So this, there's all kinds of, and then they go from there to, how much money do you make? How much did your house cost? Do you really have a car? Can you drive? They couldn't believe that a girl could drive. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you can drive. They couldn't believe that,
So when you started writing, from the beginning, your focus was on this, sort of continuum of identity and belonging and empathy and, just sort of the fluidity of culture, but also the way that culture stays with you no matter where you are, even as you evolve in certain ways. Typical American was about an immigrant couple coming to the United States. Mona in the Promised Land was about the little infant daughter who's in the first book. Now she's a teenager and she's growing up in a Jewish community in New York. Who's Irish, your first collection of short stories, was also interestingly about some of the same issues of identity. World in Town, again. You've had this kaleidoscope, or as you've put it, a lava lamp of ways of looking at and thinking about culture and identity. And I'm wondering how much of it you think sort of had its seeds, its germination in some of these early experiences you had in China that kind of made you actively think about what you had thought about your identity as a Chinese American and what you were learning and how that was sort of, changing you or maybe even amplifying certain things that you already felt were within you as part of that identity, but also making you think in new ways about some of them.
Yeah, well, I think I had much more of an intellectual, grasp of them. In other words, so it's something that maybe, early on, it's just this feeling that, my family does things differently. And that could be anything. I noticed that, in my friends' houses, they had many different kinds of soap. They had dish soap, they had bath soap, they had laundry soap. We just used like one soap for everything, And there's just like, so there's many, many, many things. But I could not, I had no kind of perspective on them. And then kind of because I'm a writer, and because, after a while I'm seeing things in my own work, I'm beginning to understand why that is. You know what I mean? Like I'm beginning to understand, certain mothering practices and it was a long evolution, but then I could see, oh, this is this and this is this. And also I can see how things change. I mean, it's not like you have this part of you and it's static. It changes. But because I have a much better intellectual grasp of it, I can sort of say, okay, this part I want to keep, actually this part, you know what I mean? I think it's fine to send it back to China. we don't need that part, I mean, it's a very hierarchical, very, very, very sexist society, We can go ahead and leave that on the other side of the Pacific. Other things, the warmth, the emphasis on family, the emphasis on self-sacrifice, I actually think is a very beautiful thing. But now, I'm beginning to sort of say, I can see what it is, so I can make a choice about it. And it's not so much just something like, it's not something, inchoate, it's something that I can describe, and like I say, which I can actually make an active decision about, and also, that I can just see the difference. So, it's definitely great material because there's so much of it. And it is really interesting, and then I just become very aware of things. Like my aunties came to visit. One of my aunties came as a visiting scholar, and she was in a she was sharing a room with 2 other visiting scholars, also from China, and there was one bed which is clearly the best bed because it was by the radiator. It was farthest away from the window, and they were right near a fire station, and what happens? Well, of course, if you're the first person to arrive, if you're the American, you take the best bed, right? No, because they're Chinese. It's like, if you're the first one there, you take the worst bed. And the second one takes the second worst, and the third one is stuck with the best bed. This is how they see it, So if you're stuck with the best bed, you must be nice to everybody else the entire semester because you have the best bed. You know what I mean? So you have to do favors to them the whole time. The whole thing is, but at another time, maybe before I started, working on this myself. Is this still on? Anyway. Before I started working on this, and writing about it and making stories out of it, I think I would have just been baffled by that kind of behavior. But now I feel like, I understand it, and in terms of what I decide for myself, I think, that's not such a bad thing. It's not such a bad thing. And so did I try it? So in terms of my own parenting, it's stuff that I've tried to bring forward. And I would sort of say, you see what your aunties did? You might be a little bit like that. You don't have to have the guilt part, but you know what? You don't have to go and always take the best bed. There's something nice about not taking the best bed.
How much do you think that kind of learning from each other have you seen in your travels and teaching in China and then back here in the States over the course of these 50 years since the start of the scene at the start of your, or that's referred to at the start of your book?
You mean how much of it's kind of borrowing back and forth?
Borrowing back and forth, sort of a blending of cultures as the U.S. and China have, not only had relations at a governmental level, but people-to-people interactions by the millions over the course of the last 50 years.
Of course, it's been an incredible amount, and it's growing because the numbers are growing. But the truth is, even before Richard Nixon went, in San Francisco, there's a large Chinese presence, and the writer Richard Rodriguez, and he sort of said, I'm becoming Chinese. I know it, So, if you spend enough time in, the same way, if you grow up in a Jewish suburb as I did, sure enough, little by little, you find a lot of Yiddish, and it's like, you're becoming a little Jewish, and very similarly, people growing in San Francisco are often quite Sinicized, because the culture is there. So I think that kind of thing was going on even before Richard Nixon went to China.
But the sort of post-cultural revolution China and...
Yeah, well, that's another thing, because a lot of people here are more Chinese, if you will, than the people there. And that's one of the, very many interesting phenomena. But, in our family, my mother kept the Chinese New Year's traditions alive, for decades by herself in America. And when I go back to China, they learn from me what's on the New Year's plate and what everything means, because it's been lost over there, and so this is a very weird thing where you are actually, the person who knows what the traditions are, and a much more kind of solid understanding of the values behind it as well. So and that's just an example of just a little example of how complicated things get, the way they're going back and forth and back and forth. I will say that I taught at Beishida, as you know, it's Beijing Normal University. I was there as a Fulbright, and I could see the students there. They were trying to learn to be like the American students. They knew they had an American professor, but that they thought just mean that they could be incredibly rude. And I'm like, actually in America we encourage the students to speak up, but it doesn't mean that they can just do whatever they want. That actually, we have internal, mores so that govern what we say. So yes, you can interrupt the professor, but you do have to put your hand up first. You can't just start talking. You say, excuse me. You say, excuse me, professor. You know what I mean, right? We don't just. So it's a funny thing too, where you can sort of see them trying to. They've heard things about the other culture and they're trying to pick them up, but sometimes there are nuances which they've missed.
So you have taught creative writing in Beijing, several times in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, and at Harvard. And you've had Chinese students from post-Cultural Revolution China. You've taught Chinese Americans. You've taught non-Chinese, let's say Americans, but also maybe visiting students. What differences did you see in writing style? I mean, can you make any kind of a generalization in terms of how people from China were approaching their stories, but also the kinds of stories they wanted to tell? How you'd answer the same thing for let's say the American students, and how much they kind of learned from each other, and maybe ended up with something that took a little from each other as they wrote.
Well, let's just say, first of all, things have changed a lot over time. So,
yeah.
So this very first class I taught in Shandong, that's 1981. And then, I'm teaching, I'm very bad with dates. But anyway, and the situations are very different. So, I'm teaching in Hong Kong University. I'm teaching Hong Kong students. So I am an American professor, but I am in a Chinese institution. And that's very different than teaching at NYU Shanghai, in which case I am in Shanghai, but I am under the umbrella of an American university, and we are supposed to be conducting those classes exactly as if we are in New York. And so these are very different situations. I will say that if the same way I sort of say with the students when they like at Beijing Normal, when they were like learning to speak up, but they did it in such a way that it was just very, very rude. Those creative writing students at NYU, the idea that they were in an American classroom, they wrote things are so like they are out there to push the boundaries. I mean, they wrote about all kinds of things, especially sexual things, which are much more daring than I have seen in any American classroom. Because this feeling that like, oh, you know what I mean, like they, the idea that now we're free or now we can do this is in all capital letters in front of them, and so they're looking for that boundary. They're looking to to trespass, and they're going right out there in a way that the American students, because they kind of take it for granted, so they're not looking to be extreme in any way. They're just like, well, what do I feel like right now? I think I'll write about my experiences at summer camp. In other words, they're not looking, they're not heady with this freedom. So you're getting very different things out of the students. I will say that I've taught in international settings several times, and for instance, I taught international kids at NYU Shanghai. The kids that come from Abu Dhabi, they're coming from all over, and also this last semester. Or this last year, I was at Harvard, and just the nature of the class, because I was teaching a class about differences in self and fiction. And so therefore, I had in my class probably about a third Asian American. But I had a lot of international students also. And I have to say that my all this stuff that I've written about the differences in self-construction between East and West. So I'm going to open with a little talk about it, and my editor's here, so she knows the very books that this is drawn on. Differences in mothering practices that have led to differences in narrative, practices, and I'm looking at the ideas that dominate in the West, and I'm looking to kind of open that up a little bit, for others. And at the end of my first lecture, my classes burst into applause. They're just like, oh my God. Finally, I don't have to kind of shoehorn myself into this structure that is just totally at odds with who I am. And then it's happening partly because I have such a large Asian American contingent, but actually a lot of women are feeling much more comfortable with this expanded idea as well, as are many of my students from Portugal. In other words, so and they would never have thought of themselves as having something in common with the Asian American students, but they do. And so that's a great example of kind of like it's leading to expanded ideas for a lot of people. So when I talk about what are those ideas, it starts with a very standard practice in many creative writing classes. In order to get the students to feel kind of comfortable that first class, they ask them, well, why don't you write a little autobiographical essay about yourself? And I think to the horror of many creative writing professors, they give that assignment the first day, and then day 2, none of the Asians come back. And they're just like, well, what happened? And they don't understand that they're very uncomfortable with this I thing. And that goes on right to the professional level. So, you think about Salman Rushdie. Salman Rushdie is not at all shy. But Salman Rushdie is, originally from India. And, and when he sat down to write a memoir, as many of you probably know that the Ayatollah Khomeini pronounced a fatwa against him, and he was recently just attacked again, very terribly. But anyway, in that the first time a fatwa was pronounced against him because of his heretical writings. He did write a memoir about that time. It's called Joseph Anton, and he found that. Now you guys said this is his 35th book or something, but when it came to writing a memoir, he was really uncomfortable using the first person, and he wrote that whole memoir in the third person. So he referred to himself as he, the whole thing. And so there's a very big difference in self-construction even among published professional writers. Ian Lee, a very, very, very accomplished writer, but she has sort of said, as soon as I say the word I, my confidence crumbles. It's a different self-construction, very uncomfortable with the first person. And as soon as I sort of said in my class, actually, Actually, there's Salman Rushdie, Ian Lee, Kazuo Ishiguro. A lot of people are uncomfortable with the first person, not just you. You could feel the whole class kind of relax, And it's like, actually, you don't have to be comfortable with the first person in order to become a writer, There's like a whole other way, and so so I think it's a great example of kind of like the Asian thing. It was liberating for more than the Asians, because it's other people from other cultures too. Sure. Or is it the Turkish? Orhan Pamuk once sort of said, he said, I look at European fiction and I do not recognize any of these characters. Kind of like basically the people that we were reading about, Emma Bovary, all these people, they are not like the people I know. And he would have loved my class, because it's the same thing. It's just like, actually, it's a non-Western self, but if you go to an MFA class in America, you may think there's only one way forward, which is the individualistic way. But actually, that is actually not the case, because many great writers actually, come from a different tradition and write from a different place.
So, for anyone interested in reading more of Gish's thoughts on this set of really interesting issues, Tiger Writing and The Girl at the Baggage Claim both dive deeply into this, and it's an idea that there's the interdependent self and the individualistic self, and we're all on a continuum, but some people are further along on one side or the other. I'm wondering whether over the course of time you've been going to China, so 40 years plus, that you've seen a shift there in China as Chinese society
Yes.
has become more affluent and there are more choices, and like how much of the interdependent self was because people really did depend on each other, and now they have a choice of, do I want to be closely connected with you, and how much do I want to be closely connected with you, and when do I want to have my own space?
Yeah, it has changed a lot. So China has become much more individualistic, although by Western standards, they're very much not like us. Do you know what I mean? So I would say that they are moving in this direction, but they'd be horrified. But it just if we ask, as of course we've moved also, we're moving the other way, and we're also moving in a more individualistic way. So a good litmus test would be a statement like, ask not what your country can, what country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. You know, the question is, do you think that's a beautiful, a noble sentiment, or do you think that is just ridiculous? And a lot of the younger people today, I mean, that is like a statement to like make fun of, you know? I mean, just like, what kind of a thing is that, you know? Whereas I think today, you know, I mean, maybe China's not an example because they're ambivalent about China, but that general idea, you know, ask not what this thing, you know, could do for you, but ask what you can do for it. For a lot of young Chinese, you know, people, that's not a ridiculous statement. I mean, I'm a Jew, but like my Chinese tutor in Shanghai, this is just like, you know, 3 years ago. You know, what is she doing? She's working, and she's saving money to buy a house for her mother. You know, I have to say that, you know that in Asia that's very common, and here I have yet to meet, you know, somebody born and bred in America who's like saving money to buy a house for their mother, you know.
And yet we do have Xi Jinping right now trying to persuade young people not to lie flat, but instead to contribute their efforts and their energy to China's rejuvenation.
See, if that's, you know, this is the same sentiment, but of course, once it's politically, you know, motivated, it becomes a different thing as well. Yeah.
So we've talked about you going to China and about the experience of Americans going to China. In the last short story in your collection, which incidentally has been praised by more than one reviewer as being as close to flawless a short story as possible, as imaginable. And I won't spoil it for you because you should read the whole thing, and ideally read the whole book all the way through because characters keep reappearing throughout the different short stories. But there is a section that's about the family coming over to Canada. And why don't I have you read that? I have one more couple of questions, and then I'd like to open it up to anyone here who would like to ask some questions.
Okay, so this is a story called Detective Dog. It is the last story in the book. I'm going to read just a little piece of it. This does it. I will start just a little bit in from the beginning. So this is a Hong Kong family that moved from Hong Kong because of the, you know, all the unrest there, and they've moved to Canada and then to New York. Been here, and this is the protagonist is the mother of the family. Betty Koo is trying to keep her family together. In Vancouver, people had complained about her. The Chinese are taking over, they said. The Chinese are buying up everything. That's when they weren't yelling, "Go back to where you came from." Betty tried to reason with them. If she were the sort of Chinese who wanted to buy in Vancouver but not live in Vancouver, if she were the sort of Chinese responsible for Vancouver's empty houses and empty apartments, how could she be standing right there for them to yell at, right? And she was not an invader, by the way. She was a parent. She was a Hong Kong parent worried that her older boy would go out protesting on the street with a yellow umbrella. And then what? And then he would get tear gassed, that's what. But a Chinese was a Chinese was a Chinese to them. When people want to yell, all they can hear is what they want to yell, her mother Tina liked to say. Which is why, after 5 years, Betty and her family finally moved from Vancouver to New York, where all anybody said was, "We are so happy you're willing to chip in for the new elevator." And, "Did you know we will soon need a new roof?" Yes, she said, yes, and anything else? Now in the gilt lobby mirror by the striped chairs, she looked happier to herself. A little plump, it was true. She did not like her chin joining up with her neck as if they just needed to be together. But she liked her short hair and her cheery cashmere hoodies. And look how she could just push her oversized sunglasses up onto her head. No puffy eyes to hide. When the Hong Kong police stormed the universities, she and Quentin and the boys sat on their lilac leather couch and watched on their computers, lined up like ladies in a hair salon. Even when COVID came, at least they worried about sickness and death, but not jail. Of course, Theo, now 16, was upset all the time. All his old Hong Kong friends were involved in the protests. Sometimes he thought he spotted them on his screen, although it was hard to say for sure because they'd grown up and because everyone was wearing gas masks. Really, it was crazy to take screenshots and zoom in the way he did, running his fingers through the long hair on top of his head and scratching the short hair on the sides. Is that Victor? Is that Pac? Don't you think that's Pac, he would say. As for whether Theo would have stayed so riled up were not ambulance sirens going and going was hard to say. It shook Betty up too, heaven knew, that even 9-year-old Robert knew that ventilator was spelt with an O-R. She was just glad he wasn't sure how to spell morgue. Although, imaginative and intense as he was writing a story with dancing morgues in it for the mystery unit in his English class. It was a murder mystery, he told her, in his quiet, unnerving way. He was not like the other boys at all. The last story he wrote was about mind-reading hats that looked like regular fur hats, but then stole your thoughts right through your scalp. How they did it was the mystery. Betty herself almost never told stories, but having read a book about how Western creativity grew up like a flower out of the soil of curiosity, she was trying to at least ask a lot of questions. And not just any questions, but the right questions. Meaning not questions like, what do you mean you were out all night? The sort of questions she was prone to ask Theo. She asked Robert questions that showed interest, like, do the morgues ever stop dancing? Playfulness, too. She had underlined that in her book. She tried to ask questions that showed playfulness. Do the morgues ever stop dancing, she asked now. Yes, and when they stop dancing, all the people are going to come out alive again, Robert said. He had had a perfect bowl cut before he started trimming it himself. Now he looked as though he'd been transitioning into Mark Zuckerberg, only to change his mind halfway. And then what? Betty said. She relied a little heavily on and then what she knew, but she couldn't think of anything else. Will they breathe okay? Yes, but they'll be a little dizzy, he said. Interesting. And what will the people say? They'll say, it's great to be alive. What happened to my phone? He said. But I'm not sure what the morgues will say back. How about, we're not responsible for personal effects, she said, thinking that he would not know what that meant. But who knew where he'd picked it up? He did know. He laughed as he wrote by hand, as he liked to with a pencil. It's great to be alive. What happened to my phone? We're not responsible for personal effects. What kind of a morgue are you? Didn't your mother teach you anything? No, we're the worst of the worst. Because of the virus, they had to scrape the bottom of the barrel. Betty laughed. Great, done, she said. I still have to figure out what the mystery is. The mystery is how all of this could be happening, she said. I'll stop there.
So what's happening now in Hong Kong is pretty grim. What's happening in U.S. China relations is, I think if we were back 10, 15 years ago, very unexpected that we'd be at this point now. You work with your imagination not just to talk about the past and to talk about characters that experience some aspect of how things have been over the last half century. You also actually have written a work of science fiction that included the resistors, which included, a pretty strong focus on surveillance and a state that controlled people's lives. Not that that is directly related here, but there is more control these days now in China. And
I will say that part of the resistors is absolutely, influenced by my time in China.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to ask you to make predictions, because that, none of us are going to be able to do that with any accuracy. But as you think about where we are now, maybe you could reflect a bit about, like, what surprises you most about how we got here, and what you see in the present that you think might be the seeds of something that could go forward the same way that you, when you were in China in the early 80s, started to see something. You didn't really know which way it would go, but like if you see something that looks like it's, it's very easy to be pessimistic in this moment. Are you seeing any cause for being at least a little bit more positive in looking at the ways that the two countries have, just the two countries, but Americans and Chinese have interacted over the course of this last half century, that something about that has staying power, even as we go through this difficult era?
Well, first of all, big things can happen very suddenly. The same way Nixon going to China, like nobody would have predicted that 3 years, before he went. And then suddenly, the times are right. Things are ready to move, and then it's just like a fire, and somebody, the kindling is sitting there. All you need is the match, and it goes up. I actually think it's very obviously, who knows what will happen in China. But I think that for some time there's been a lot of internal dissonance. So, like, I was in southern China in a very remote place, this wonderful Airbnb. I was there with my daughter. And, we're hanging out with a bunch of people. And a lot of them are quite, modern, westernized, normal people. And so they're talking very freely. And there's this one couple that's really holding back, and they're not saying anything. Everyone else is having a good time, and they're letting loose about the government and everything else. And they're holding back. And then all of a sudden, like on day 3, they suddenly say, "We're Communist Party members." And we shouldn't be saying this, but we hate being Communist Party members. And we came all the way here to escape it because everybody hates us. And out it all comes, and we had suspected because they were driving a very, very fancy car. And so we had suspected, but people go on, and I just think about this is this is not that uncommon to find people who are the very upholders of the state are actually quite ambivalent. They don't like having to do what they have to do. They don't like it that everybody hates them. You just wonder how long that can go on. And that's not they're not the only ones. There's a lot of people. They say one thing, but in their hearts, they're not with it. Just like and this is among the party members. So, as they have like all these apps where they're supposed to be checking in all the time. And, the number of people who have found some way of kind of like making it appear that they're checking in all the time, but actually they're out doing something else. So they're just, it's like anything else. They're just kind of working around it. But they're not, their hearts, you just wonder how sustainable that is. Now, on the other side, we have, a surveillance state the likes of which we've never seen before. And maybe that's enough to hold all these people in check. But foundationally, as I would say also culturally, this has been a culture from the get-go, and I think right up to today, where everything is cat and mouse, and they don't really like regulation, and they don't really believe in in following rules. So in Shanghai, you have a one-way street. It says very clearly one way. They're trying to get everybody go one way. And if you've been in Shanghai, you know that those scooters are going the other way. They're just going down the sidewalk now, And this goes on until finally the authorities quietly take the one-way sign away. They can't get the population to cooperate, And so I think you have a population that, fundamentally has always looked askance at authority. And you're looking at a situation, as there are people who refuse to pay their mortgages because that whole real estate thing is so crazy. You have people refusing to pay their mortgages. You have a lot of internal dissonance. I have to say that I think that, and then they're becoming the powers that be are becoming more and more repressive. I don't know that it's so stable. But it could be a long time before the match, somebody comes with the right match, But I have to say, like, look, who can predict? Do I think things are going to be changing in the next 5 years? No. Do I think that, like, that come 50 years from now, because you and I won't be around to see it, that actually things had changed once again in completely the opposite direction? I think that's entirely possible.
There's also the fact, certainly there's some dissidence within China. There certainly is a sort of streak of like, well, regulations are just sort of a suggestion. Let's move around it. But I think that's
suggestion.
I think that's changed a bit over the last decade in the Xi Jinping era, and also there's now there's a lot of national pride. There's genuine national pride, and it's hard to know how much there's full support for Xi Jinping's rejuvenation and the way he's approaching it, and what that means at home. But
yeah, well, that's an excellent point, and I think that sort of on the pessimistic column, you would have to say that because they started the brainwashing so early now. Do you know what I mean? Because they started in elementary school, and and so it's so I mean, I'm not I don't mean to be any Pollyanna here, and I would say that kind of overall I feel very distressed by what's happening in China, and I'm overall certainly quite pessimistic in the short run. Well, like I say, but this business of like it's only a game, and there's there's the idea that there's a backdoor, there's a way around things, that stuff is pretty deeply embedded too. So like I say, it's not like I wouldn't predict like, oh yeah, no, don't worry, this is a passing phase. I wouldn't predict that. But if you ask me if there's a glimmer of hope, I see a glimmer of hope kind of in, if you want to call it, the Chinese character. It's been there for a long time. It's hard to get rid of stuff like that. They've tried to get rid of things before, as you know, and they've never been entirely successful in any of those efforts. So,
yeah.
But now they have technology. So it's it's a scary moment for sure.
A good time to turn to questions from you all. Yeah.
When was the last time you were in China?
I was thinking the last time I was in China, 2019.
Yeah, my question was basically, have you been in China since COVID?
No, and I would love to go, but I don't dare go now. I mean, because the atmosphere, as I don't, it's terrifying, and.
Yeah, question over here. We actually would like you to use the mic because
Sure.
then when people are watching the video later, they can hear your question.
However you can answer this question, I'm just really intrigued. What is your interpretation of what Xi Jinping did to Hu Jintao? I just can't get it, because they don't they script everything, so why in front of the world? Can you just take a stab at the possibilities?
I don't know any more than anybody else knows.
But what you saw, how would you?
But I have to say that, under any circumstances, to humiliate, a figure like Hu Jintao, I mean, it's a display of power that is just stunning. Of just raw power and disregard for anything else, and I was stunned, and it's scary. I mean, it's scary. So I mean, people later on when they're looking at the history books, at what point did yada 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 did we realize that, oh my God, this is definitely we're not in Kansas anymore. Certainly, this will be one of the moments that they look at.
Other questions? I see a hand way in the back. And
Hi, thank you very much. In terms of the arts, is there an element of real creativity, individualism?
In individualism?
In terms of the arts?
Yeah.
Sculpture?
in China.
Yeah. So to me, we can have huge creativity and artistic expression, and it is completely independent of the relative individualism of a country. So, I mean, you can have a very high, we have had very, very, I should talk about this in The Girl with the Baggage Claim. You can have very great art come out of very interdependent cultures. That's not just true of the East, that's true of the West too. So if you think about it, if in a general kind of way, if you think of it as an interdependent culture as being one that doesn't stress originalities quite so heavily, so that would mean a culture, for example, where it's fine to do another Madonna and Child, and no one's going to say, like, but that's already been done, you know? So you can sort of say, yes, it's okay to do that. Then you're kind of in interdependent territory. But nonetheless, you can still, some people are Giotto and the other people are not Giotto. you know. So you can, and the Giotto, it may be coming, it may have followed many Madonna and Childs, but the Giotto is still Giotto, right? It's still great in a new way. So so I would say that you can have greatness from any culture. I would say that in a general kind of way, though, when you have as repressive a culture as they have in China, that it's not conducive to great art, you know, because it's just so repressive, and because they want to tell people what to say. And I think that a lot of those great artists, like Von Kwan, these people, you know, even back in the day, they would go to the mountains, you know, to get away from the court, you know, in order to make these great works. And I think that today it's harder to get away from the court. And so it's, you know, I'm not going to say I'm sure there's still great work coming out, but it's, you know, it's hard. You know, here too we have pressures. I mean, especially commercial pressure. So Ong Lee, you know, the director who has made, who's worked in both China and America, he says it's more difficult to make work here because of the commercial pressure from Hollywood. The commercial pressure is so intense that he says that, you know, honestly, it's not harder. It's easier to deal with the censorship in China. I don't know if he would say that today, but he has said that, you know, as of a couple of years ago. So,
Rachel?
Well, actually, this is kind of flipping what you just said, because on the one hand, there's a repression, but artists are often working, you know, just the way you said. They're finding workarounds of saying things that have double meanings.
yes.
So, and that is certainly you know, an important part of the work that I've seen, whether that's contemporary theater or film. So I'd be curious about some of your observations in terms of those multi-layered readings and how the metaphor can have double messages.
You know, you're absolutely right about that. You know what I mean? And I will say that kind of art where it's where certain people are getting it, that, you know, that this thing, you know, this thing is not, it's not a pig, it's a, you know, it's this, that thing. You know, but it seems like nonetheless so much energy goes to the kind of the coding and the decoding that that it doesn't. I don't want to generalize, but it seems to me not necessarily conducive to the kind of open-endedness and bottomlessness that we do tend to associate with the very greatest work. Do you know what I mean? So I'm not saying that it's not creative, it's not innovative, it's not bold, but in the end, the work that tends to stand for all time tends to be it tends to be in the ineffable, you know, end of things. And I think it's a little harder to get there when you're so busy, you know, playing these games with the censor brilliantly as they may be playing that game. That's a huge generalization, which I may regret having made, but off the top of my head.
Other questions? Yeah, there's a hand up front here.
So this book, the title prompts me to think about Trump. Kind of, you know, in the U.S. context, you know, there are lots of comparisons to be made between Trump and Nixon domestically, and also Trump had a lot to do with bringing China to the forefront of, you know, American consciousness, even in a way than it, you know, not that it wasn't there before, but even more. Also, you know, sorry, this is a really long preamble, but I was in law school in 2016. That was my last year. And you know, that was 2015, 2016. That is when Trump came down the escalator, and, you know, and everyone, he became a topic of conversation among everyone. The only people in law school I knew who supported Trump, like the Republican, you know, the conservatives were very, you know, saying, no, this is not us. We do not want anything to do with this person. But Chinese law students were, it felt like a breath of fresh air for them, as in, you know, this is yes, this is the the American kind of liberal perspective is somebody has finally kind of taken the mask off, and it's not that all Chinese students were Trump supporters or anything, but those are the only people I knew. So I guess my question is, obviously it would be for very different reasons, but do you ever think there will be a future where, Chinese people look back and say, thank you, Mr. Trump?
Oh. I don't know if they'll ever say thank you, Mr. Trump, because actually he's imposed so many restrictions on China, they don't like it at all. So even if they liked him, I don't think they like what he's done. But I will say, it is interesting, this business of so many Chinese people having liked Trump is very interesting. They have a phrase in China for basically politically correct speech, which is bites wall, right? And that you may have heard if you know. So basically, they're very impatient with PC talk. Now, it's very complicated because what they actually hate about, what they don't understand about PC talk, or the kind of what they see as phoniness in Americans. What they don't understand is in a very individualistic culture, in order, if everyone is going to have their own voice and they're going to speak, we have to have internal, guidelines. This goes back to my students who thought, well, now that I'm free, I can just interrupt the professor. But actually, we actually internalize a lot of rules that enable us all to speak up. And that means that you raise your hand. That means that we try to have rules of engagement. Because they come from such a different system, they see all that politeness as phony. In other words, they think you're just not saying what you mean. It's a completely different system because most of the time when they just say what they mean, they are in a family situation or, it's not open to the public. So the same way that, you might go home and with your family, you may say, oh, that bleeping, I can't believe. But in public, you don't say it. You might still be critical, but in a public space, you would sort of say, I really disagree with your policy on X. You don't say, what do you think? What do you? So they don't see that it's because we're speaking in such a different environment that we have to be circumspect about some things, or that we talk in a kind of a formalized manner, which you'll see even like when you think about the January 6th, hearings. It's very striking that Pence is his whole life is in danger, and they continue to speak in this very formal. Everyone, what they really mean is like, holy crap! Do you realize what's happening? We are all like dead meat, but nobody says that. They say, excuse me, Mr. Vice President, I think it would be best if you, blah, 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 blah. And the Chinese are very, like I say, they think it's phony. And the Chinese also, among friends, what they will say is, biakuchi, don't be polite. To be polite is to be phony. And so what they saw in Trump was somebody who was like them, who also thought it was phony. And I actually don't think that's what's going on with Trump. In other words, I think that they saw it as being something akin to a feeling that they have. But I don't think they actually understood what Trump was doing at all. So, and then when he went on to enact these policies, they felt almost kind of betrayed because they thought that he was kind of one of them. So.
You have time for maybe one? Yeah, Rachel.
Well, that leads me to think about the whole notion of authoritarianism and alternate interpretations of what's being said by those who are coming in as authoritarians. And I'm just wondering if you have any reflections, because it is happening at a global level in many different countries. But I'm seeing, I think you've really elucidated some really interesting questions that come up with that. So I'm just wondering, any reflections on cultural interpretations of authoritarianism that goes from what you've just said about, which I thought was pretty interesting about, some Chinese people interpreting Trump in one way. Any thoughts?
Well, I don't know if this is exactly an answer to your question, but I think that, I do not want to say that Chinese culture in particular is predisposed to authoritarianism, but, they have a kind of realism. It's a kind of basically very realistic attitude toward things. And so if you to ask your average Chinese, well, what matters more to you, freedom of speech or freedom from authoritarian government, self-determination, or, a full rice bowl, many Chinese would pick the rice bowl. And there's just a kind of a realism there. And, the kind of realism that comes when you have had many periods of starvation. I think here in America, people don't really understand starvation very well. They don't really remember. People who've been through the Depression, stuff like that, they remember, but a lot of people don't remember here. In China, no one has forgotten. And so there is a kind of realism there. And so I wouldn't say that predisposes them to authoritarianism, but I think that that's not, being free of authoritarianism is not number one on their list, being safe and being fed is number one. And I think that, and also I will say again, I'm being talking such huge generalizations, makes me a little bit nervous, but, I think in times of incredible rapid change, as we are seeing with globalization and technology, people kind of like, an authority figure. It just makes them less nervous. And I think that, a lot of the things that we see going on in the world, including, all the migration, is, we're kind of insulated from it here. We have some, look, we have just DeSantis sending people, to Martha's Vineyard, but DeSantis, but we don't have huge numbers of refugees, arriving suddenly, in Manhattan. And I think that a lot of people are pretty freaked out. And it's always hard to know how we would react if we were in their shoes. I don't know if that's kind of an answer, but I think that there's a lot of turmoil on many different levels right now, and I think that that's feeding some of this populism and so on. So,
and that's sobering note. Please join me in thanking Gish Jen for being here this evening. And thank you for coming. Thanks to our virtual audience. Gish's new paperback, Thank You, Mr. Nixon, the paperback version of the hardcover book. So now there are copies in the back, and Gish would be happy to sign if you'd like to buy one.
Thank you for coming.